I want to come back to the exercise and autophagy piece and hone in there. So the way I understood that, when we exercise, we're priming the muscle, we're bringing down the threshold in which we can enter autophagy, so it won't need the same amount of fasting to get to that point. Is there any specific autophagy happening during the exercise itself, or is it just bringing that threshold down for when we're fasting?
Jesse, this is such a great question. Yeah, I think what is based upon the research that I've dove into. I'm not a primary investigator in this field, but based upon the research that I've read, when we exercise, we are damaging our muscle tissue. Whether we're doing sprints, we're going for a long hike, we're doing F45 or Orange Theory, or we're doing push-ups or resistance training, we're damaging our muscle tissue. And the way that exercise, part of the signaling molecules and the adaptations that we get from exercise are in that rebuilding process in the post-exercise window. And it turns out that a key mediator in that rebuilding process is all of the pathways of autophagy. And so autophagy increases as a response to exercise. And so with that being said, there's an additional mechanism here, and that is a signaling molecule within our cells in our brain and our liver known as AMPK. This is a marker of cellular energy, to make it very simple. This is how the drug metformin works. It affects AMPK. This is how the dietary supplement known as berberine, which is one of my favorite natural products to support metabolic health, it's theorized to work on AMPK, among other mechanisms. When we exercise, we increase cellular AMPK in both our liver, skeletal muscle, probably in the heart tissue, maybe in the brain as well. And so AMPK, it turns out, is what initiates autophagy when we fast as well. So what happens when we start to fast? We have our last meal of the night. Let's say we eat dinner. We're doing a 16-8 eating window. Our feeding windows, whatever, 10 to 6 p.m. or something like that. We have dinner at 6 p.m. By 10, 11, 12, our glucose is dropping, our insulin is dropping, AMPK is going to start to increase. Well, people who exercise, they're signaling molecules of these autophagy initiation drivers. The gas pedal to stimulate autophagy is AMPK. And so when we're regularly exercising, there's less cobwebs and rust on this machinery. It's just much more efficient. We're used to stimulating AMPK when we hop on the Concept 2 rower, or we hop on the ski erg, or we hit the assault bike, or we do a sprint. We're naturally affecting these intracellular switches, and that process just becomes more efficient on the cellular level. So that's part of it, but also I think the damage as well. So if you ever feel sore from a workout and you have that delayed onset muscle soreness, part of how your body's dealing with and repairing the muscle fibers, the myocytes themselves, and the sarcomere and so forth, is by way of autophagy. So it's part of just the signaling's better, but also the actual so-called cellular damage that is needed. And that's why intensity matters. I think this is what brings up a good point, Jesse, is like, I sometimes see people that just go to the gym, they're on their phone and they're just kind of doing low intensity stuff. That's way better than sitting on the couch, but it might be insufficient to maximally stimulate this organ system that's so important, the musculoskeletal system. So we need to have a little bit of intensity. It needs to be hard. We often use in the personal training world relative perceived exertion, RPE. So an RPE 10 out of 10 would be like, you cannot go anymore. If you do 100 push-ups, you're going to have an RPE of 10 by the 70th push-up, let's just say, for example. And so we want to work between the 6 and 10 RPE range. So a 6 would be like, okay, I can barely have a conversation. It's like you're short of breath. It's hard enough, and you could probably do 3 or 4 more reps. We want to work in that realm of 6 to 10 RPE, not always at 10, not always at 6, kind of change based upon, consecutive workout sessions. Maybe last week you did 3 sets of 10 at RPE of 6. And then the next workout session a week later for, say, chest or legs, you could do 3 sets or 5 sets of 3, right? Where you're doing an RPE of 10 out of 10. So those 3 reps are like near maximal exertion, so just kind of varying a little bit. So you're hitting different muscle fibers. And I think this is another point when it comes to supporting the health of the brain. When you're especially doing new exercises, novel exercises, you're inducing a lot of different neuronal signaling pathways. And that's why there's a ton of research showing that people who exercise have much lower rates of cognitive decline, mild cognitive impairment, and Alzheimer's disease, because it turns out that, when you're exercising, you're stimulating the brain, just like when you learn a new language or play a piano. A lot of the early adaptations to exercise are cognitive based, are through the central nervous system and the nervous system itself. And so that's another reason to, I think, exercise and try new things throughout your life.
I'm glad you brought it around to the intensity piece. That's where I was going next. So we've emphasized the importance of getting our steps in and walking. But when it comes to the autophagy piece, that's separate. We need to do higher intensity to get that benefit.
Yeah, either higher intensity or higher volume. It turns out that high volume endurance athletics is a great way to stimulate autophagy as well. So recreational runners and triathletes and swimmers generally have, and this was actually a study that was done by folks in Sweden where they looked at the muscle tissue and the proteome and different types of protein signaling molecules and genes that are activated in athletes. They had a sedentary control group. They had a endurance athletic group that had at least 15 years of training. And this was both men and women. And then they had a group that had 15 years of resistance training. And so, we're basically comparing like marathon runners to like strength athletes. And actually what they found is that the endurance athletes had, it was like 690 different genes and proteins that were expressed in the muscle tissue and in the blood compared to sedentary controls. And about 90 or 95% of those genes and proteins were related to mitochondrial function. Also immune health. I mean, there was all sorts of different proteins, but a lot of it was mitochondrial based. So I thought that was interesting. And there was, I want to say the strength athletes, it was closer to like 400 different genes and proteins compared to the sedentary control. So I don't know. I think a mix of both, the intensity with the strength training, but also finding a sport where you can do some zone 2 stuff. And this could be walking, this could be swimming, hiking, trekking with poles, cross-country skiing. I mean, something that you like to do and enjoy, that low intensity but higher volume is actually quite good, it turns out. So that was interesting.
Okay, let's stick on autophagy. So we know fasting, we know exercise, those both stimulate it.
Yeah, so there's a lot of excitement and fervor around spermidine, which is a compound found in grains, like we talked about earlier, maybe in sourdough bread. It's also found in mushrooms. There's NMN and NR and these niacin derivatives that have been really popular as of late. I'm less excited about those just because the human clinical trials are not that convincing, number one. And number two, they're very expensive. So that's something that I'm not a huge fan of, but it's out there. I think spermidine makes a lot of sense. But again, when we talk about the seasonally available diet and so forth, having mushrooms in the fall when they're available. Mushrooms, here, I'm sure in Ontario as well, it starts raining in the fall. All of a sudden, there's mushrooms everywhere. That's a great time of year to start consuming mushrooms. Do you have mushrooms on 4th of July? Maybe, maybe not, but it's hard to find mushrooms in the summer. There's morels in the June, but that's a different conversation. So spermidine is something to put on your radar. NMN, NR, NAD, again, super expensive. If you have unlimited financial resources, want to blow money on it, fine. But I think the best way to change NAD in your muscles is to do some combination of time-restricted feeding and also exercise. That's my opinion there. I'm excited about berberine because it's really affordable. We're talking $25-$30 a month. And berberine, I started tinkering with this, got really excited about the research in 2010 and started personally measuring berberine, its effectiveness when I got into intermittent fasting and wearing a continuous glucose monitor. And I was actually giving a talk in Winnipeg. I remember being on the airplane. I was wearing a continuous glucose monitor. I was about to miss my flight leaving Ontario to go to Winnipeg, and they didn't honor my TSA pre. I had to sit in this long line. My continuous glucose monitor started to climb up because stress is another acute thing that can raise your blood glucose. And I took some berberine and it dropped my glucose like a rock. And it stayed really, really low for about 6 hours. And I tested my ketones. And so when you take berberine, it can drop your glucose and increase ketones quite profoundly. And so I think that as an autophagy initiation supplement or mimicker makes a lot of sense, because how do we get autophagy to increase? Well, we have to have low insulin, low glucose, and high glucagon. And that's the same recipe that you need to have ketones increased as well. So I think we can use ketones as a biomarker, indirectly triangulate autophagy in our body. Some people might argue with me or things like that. We just don't have commercial tools to measure autophagy, really. But we know that if we're fasted, our glucose is going to drop, insulin's going to drop, glucagon will increase, and that will help to increase ketones and stimulate this process of autophagy. So berberine is really exciting for me. Most studies show that around 500 milligrams 2 to 3 times per day is pretty effective. I recommend people just try it with their last meal or empty stomach first thing in the morning to elongate their fast. There's urethrin A. I think a lot of people are excited about that. That helps to increase that intracellular switch that we mentioned earlier, known as AMPK. And that is, of course, increased with both exercise as well as fasting. I haven't taken urethrin A. I know it's out there. I don't know the cost. I like to recommend, because I do think people need vitamin D. They need to supplement with vitamin K. Most people are not getting enough zinc and magnesium. Based upon if people eat fish or not, I do, especially if they want kids, omega-3 fats, really important. Running their omega-3 index through Omega Quant. This is a blood spot test you can do at home. Really important stuff. There's some foundational things that people need, and then to throw on NAD and NMN and urethrin A, we're talking hundreds of dollars a month. I'd rather people spend 50 or 60 on fundamentals and put that other food towards grass-fed beef or a gym membership, So not super excited about urethrin A. I have heard of some people getting pretty good benefits from it. I've never personally supplemented with spermidine, but I eat mushrooms and we have sourdough. I'm confident there's enough spermidine in that for me. There's the drug rapamycin, I'm sure you've heard about. Alan Green is a medical doctor in Long Island. I interviewed him. He has a clinic, rapamycin clinic, I think is the name. This is a drug that I think can be helpful, not just for autophagy, but for people with the ApoE4 genotype. And so these are individuals that are at genetically higher risk of developing Alzheimer's and mild cognitive impairment. It turns out in his clinical experience, ApoE4 genotype individuals tend to respond better long-term to rapamycin low dose. So that's something to consider. Metformin has been theorized to increase autophagy. This is a drug that is derived from the French lilac plant, just like berberine. This is it's a pharmaceutical, but it's essentially a natural product. So that could be used as well. But in my opinion, berberine has a 3,000 year use in traditional Chinese medicine and Ayurvedic medicine. It works very similarly to metformin, and several studies in India comparing berberine to metformin don't see much of a clinically significant difference in metabolic health and blood glucose parameters. So I steer people towards that more often. But those are the categories of things that I would suggest. People go down the rabbit hole of this old oncology drug known as dasatinib and quercetin as a protocol to stimulate and purge some of the senescent cells. And similar to in people who have metabolic dysfunction, they might have an accumulation of immune cells that are aged, and these are called senescent. These are rusty cells. And these cells are problematic because they recruit other healthy cells to become rusty or senescent. And these cells are very curious because they normally, when a cell becomes dysfunctional, there's a deficiency of autophagy. They accumulate intracellular proteins. Their cell membranes are damaged. Their mitochondria is dysfunctional. Normally, those cells would apoptose and die and not be a problem. But as we get older, we start to lose this natural apoptosis process, and these senescent cells accumulate, and they recruit healthy cells to behave badly as well. And this can be a very serious problem, especially when it comes to immune system health. And so there are protocols like enhancing autophagy we've been talking about, and people are using senescent therapies like dasatinib and quercetin and other peptides to stimulate that. So I think that's a little bit more experimental at this point, but the 4 or 5 that I mentioned, and I personally think berberine makes the most sense, along with exercise, and possibly vitamin D, vitamin K, as natural tools to just overall support metabolic health and get some of the benefits from that and stimulate autophagy that way.
If you enjoyed that clip, you're going to want to head over here and catch a full episode. I'll see you over there.
The thing that's going against us, especially if we're living life blind and drinking soda and having just sandwiches and french fries and not moving, is as our metabolism falls into the so-called insulin resistant or metabolically dysfunctional category, we naturally become more catabolic. Our muscle becomes compromised. And part of that is because